Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's Ryan Martin here from Real Schools. Pretty excited to talk about measuring what matters this afternoon, particularly the how to tell what counts in schools and how we should count it. I do apologise if you were in the webinar earlier. We just had a couple of technical issues, and as a result, you might have heard our voices. Chris, our admin manager, and myself were sort of madly scrambling to get the webinar control panel sorted out, but we've managed to do that. I've had a really interesting day today, and normally I would get straight into this, but I'm up in Darwin at the moment, and I'm hedged myself in a little meeting room just away from the main group that I've been working with today, and I've been involved in a really exciting project that's running up here called the Northern Territory Learning Commission. And I've been pulling apart a whole raft of data for the group schools that are in there. And essentially what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is all about measuring what matters, particularly for this project, because obviously the principal that sits behind the project, John Cleary from Casuarina Street down in Katherine, he wants to make sure that the work that he's doing, in particular at Casuarina across the other Katherine schools and now a bigger group of schools, is having significant impact across his schools. So the measurement the range of measurement that we're using in order to understand how these kids are going across some really complex and diverse schools has been a really interesting piece of work, and I'll certainly share some of that with you this afternoon. I suppose the big piece of work around this area is looking at how we value add to our students, and making sure that when we get some baseline data on our kids, that we have a measure that we're really comfortable with, and staff are, but also that we have an ability to check in and check out to see how kids are going, how staff are going, and whether we're being successful in the work that we're doing, whether it be just a normal program or an intervention type program that we're using to support a group of students who are not progressing or really struggling, or even some high flyers that are just not making the progress that we would like them to make. So I'm going to move through a slide deck tonight, and I'll talk. There'll be a moment in a couple of slides where I'll ask you to answer a couple of questions. I'd like to get a bit of a bearing on who are the people that are in the audience or are listening in this afternoon. Who are those people? And certainly make sure that I direct my attention to the areas of most need throughout the next 45 minutes that we're together. So once again, thanks so much for jumping on board today and being part of this webinar. I just wanted to put a couple of things before I go to the next slide, and I hadn't included these in the slides, but as I've been sitting in this professional development today and the meeting that I've just been involved in, there was something that came up that was quite interesting, and it was a question that sat around, how do we measure disengagement? And so I'd let you ponder on that for a little bit. And the other one I suppose it's a cautionary statement, and I'm going to throw some things out there, and I think it's always a danger whenever you're at professional development, or whether you're listening to on a particular topic that you may be a little bit passionate about, is I want you to think big, but I want your first step to be a small one. And why I say that is often these big ideas are so big that we don't actually get them started. So just a cautionary one is around thinking big and acting small. And the other one was, and I just want you to think about this as we move through this stuff, is how do we measure disengagement, because certainly these kids in Catherine, through this Northern Territory Learning Commission, they have had a really strong voice in this space, and it's been very interesting to hear their reflection on what is disengagement to them. So, okay, next slide. So when we talk about this, I briefly covered this before, was this idea that when it comes to measuring what matters, we want to measure things that we can see or give us an indication of whether we're value adding to groups of students. And when I say that, one of the reasons I suppose I think a little bit about this value adding is my wife at the moment, it's one of those things at the end of our Christmas period, and we have, you know, rich foods, lots of food. It could be a bit of a typical Australian boozy Christmas. And we often, after Australia Day, I certainly, through my network of people, had a lot of people saying, oh, February, I'm really going to knuckle down. I'm not feeling as good as I'd like. I've had a big Christmas. I've missed some exercise. I'm going to get back into it. And it generally lines up with when we're back, I suppose, at work, and things start to become more consistent, and the kids are at school. And I use the exercise example because, and I'm sure my wife would really appreciate me sharing this, but she decided to jump on this program called the F45 Challenge, and it includes diet, recipes, the whole lot. So she's cooking separately from us, exercising at ridiculous hours of the morning just so that she can get it done before school. And what they did was gather some data at the very, very start. And part of that data was, my wife wasn't too keen on this, but it was a body scan. They look at your diet. They then look at some really basic fitness measurements. And what I liked about the approach is that my wife is absolutely going to know the value that this program, for the 8 weeks that she's doing it, she'll absolutely know the value that's been added to her, and that might be a loss of weight, some skin fold measurements, feeling healthier, all those types of things. She will know in 8 weeks whether this has had an impact. And sometimes in schools, we miss that opportunity because we either leave it too long, or we're not checking in and checking out to check that we're having we're adding value where we can to these kids. So I think it's always important to look at, where are we starting, what is our measure, and how often will we check? How will we know the impact that we've had? And once we know the impact that we've had, what are going to be the next steps? And I think that's a really critical thing to consider, is that once we know where, if there's been change or if there hasn't, it's really important that we don't hide or shy away from the fact that it doesn't always work, but we fleshed out those next steps. And who do we flesh those next steps out with as well? So I just I did a webinar a little while back, and I used the GPS. I'm sorry about, it's a bit of a pixelated screenshot here, but when one of the I suppose the traps with data is we take data just on the number, and we don't consider a little bit like the GPS. And I'm about to walk back into the bullpit tomorrow when I arrive back in Melbourne, and I have to negotiate my way across the city for some work that I'm doing, and I will use my GPS to give me a guide of where I'm going. But if I don't like exactly what that GPS tells me to do, I'm probably going to make slight adjustments. Now, that could be catastrophic for me arriving on time, but the idea that our data is just one piece of information, and as teachers and experts in our field, we've got the ability to actually go, yeah, but maybe there's more to that story, or yeah, that seems like a good way to go, but maybe we could get there going this way. And I like that. That approach to me is a really powerful approach, because it's putting trust in our teachers, and it's saying to them, you're the expert, so as a group of teachers or a teacher, I'm going to back you in to do this, but I want to make sure that you've got a measure of whether you've been successful from the start to the end. Did it work? And if it didn't, what would you do differently the next time? And I just wanted to share with you a couple of things that I suppose that when we talk about data, that we really want to consider that we're moved and inspired by data and not scared of it, and that you're having an impact. And I've been working at I did some work a year ago at Summers Primary School, and it was just the most beautiful school down on Western Port Bay on the Mornington Peninsula. And in my first meeting, one of my first questions to the principal there was, well, let's have a look at the data. And so initially they wanted to go down a path of a behaviour management type project that they were going to run around restorative practices, something that Adam and I do a lot of work on around Australia. And I said to them, look, I'm more than happy to do that, but let's check that that's what is needed. And so we started to gather some data over a few weeks. So I certainly wasn't keen to rush straight into the school and not have something to reference when I first started interacting with them. And we looked at office referrals, detention, suspension, and we gathered that from a number of sources within the school. And by the time that sort of 3 or 4 weeks had gone through, it was really apparent that, yep, they were right. But what it did do, yes, it took 4 weeks to do, but it actually allowed the project to start at a much stronger position, because we had some evidence that we could leverage that evidence and say, hey, guess what? This is what it looks like, and we need to do something about it. And that was a piece of work that I've been doing with Summers now for a couple of years, and it finished at the end of last year and had a really good impact in class, and particularly on that suspension data and office referrals, because the teachers essentially, through the restorative process, took back ownership of that work in their room in a really powerful way. Now, Casuarina Street's in a different way. They use their data initially to look at essentially Casuarina Street is a school that it's a challenging area, Catherine, but Casuarina Street has a pretty decent cohort of kids, and they were doing okay, but from John's point of view, they could be doing better. And so he investigated a range of different ideas, and he's always had a real bent on giving students voice in their learning. And so the Learning Commission has been something that's now grown to about 15 schools in the Northern Territory, and the results have been extraordinary, both in teacher effectiveness and in student outcomes. And they're using data constantly to reference back on what's working and what's not working. And it's a complete feedback loop that they're using, and they're always making, I suppose you would say that they're tinkering. They're tinkering with this Learning Commission all the time, and that has been some of the work that we've been doing in this room, in the room in Darwin today, has been tinkering at the Learning Commission so that it fits all these different schools now that are jumping on board with the program. And they've been using a really great tool that I've been using in schools called student maps. And those student maps essentially map kids against scale scores and allow, I suppose, teachers to sit down with the students and talk the kids through their results and where they sit and what their next steps are, in the same way that we want teachers, when they meet, to look at what the results are, where they've got to, and what their next steps are. So a really powerful piece of work that's occurring up here, and it's all about, for them, measuring what matters. They've got some good tools that they use, and their teachers are really well versed and have great capacity to run those assessments to get really clean data on their kids. So there's been a number of different projects. I just thought I'd mention a couple of them, but this whole idea is that we build the capacity of our teachers and leaders to follow a really consistent process where the collective experience that they have, particularly using this GPS idea, is valued. if you sit around a table at your staff room and you said to the people in your staff room, write down on a sticky note how many years you've been teaching, and you added that up across your staff room, you'd be well over 100, I'm sure. And that means that often we go looking for answers outside of our school walls, but you think with that collective experience, there's probably some fantastic answers and solutions sitting right in front of you. And it's about building that that collaborative culture as you measure, and when you're looking for answers, that you certainly look beyond just outside of the school, but you're looking within the school as well. So I don't know whether you would remember many years ago, I certainly do, that there was a Sara Lee ad, and it went layer upon layer upon layer. Now, I love custard tarts, so this is a tough slide. I'll try not to stay on this slide too long because it'll just make me hungry. But the reason why I've put this up here, there's a method to my madness. I remember that one of the reasons I was thinking, a principal had said to me recently, is just so many layers, and strangely my brain went to the Sara Lee ad, and that's absolutely the truth, that the layers of data that sometimes we gather puts massive amount of pressure right across the school. And I suppose establishing one of the first things, particularly when you start to think about, well, we've got a lot of data and I don't know what exactly we're doing with all of this stuff, is sometimes you almost need to have a bit of an audit and figure out establishing the measures that actually matter and how you can communicate the impact that can you, from those measures, communicate the impact that teachers are having on students. And that can be challenged if you've got a lot of pieces of data and you're not exactly sure what the purpose of it is. So I think that data audit is a really important piece of work to do initially, just to establish what's really important for us, what do we actually want to measure here, and then how will we check in and how often will we check in to see that we've been successful. And I noticed when we talk about this layer upon layer, there was, even this week, just I sort of scratched my head, having been sitting in the principal's chair a couple of years ago, and almost feeling as though, and I'm sure as teachers, that you're almost deflecting a lot of stuff as it comes over your table. You do the stuff you know you got to do, but some stuff you're deflecting. And I noticed this week there was a article in the paper that was talking about kids as young as 8 needing career counselling, and I nearly spat I was actually sitting in a coffee shop and I nearly spat my coffee out and I sort of laughed a little bit. I thought, I'm not sure really at the age of 8 right now, the jobs that these kids are going to be walking into even exist. And so, yes, it's important for kids to be aware of jobs and what it looks like to work. I'm not sure career counselling is a good use of our time. And again, it's just that another layer. So when schools need to, I suppose, add layers, and I think, and being careful about this, is I would be adding layers once you've had a really good audit of what you're currently doing. And I wouldn't be adding layers unless you know that it's going to be advantageous to the kids. And again, grounded in research, you want to know that it works. It would be crazy to take up a program or a project just because you heard someone else doing it. You want to check that it's grounded in research. Teachers and leadership are so busy that you don't want to be 6 months, a year down the track and this is having zero impact because it's actually not that good a program in the first place. You really want to make sure that you've got that right. And I think it's important when we talk about picking up another layer or adding another layer, we keep the good stuff. We might need to modify or tinker the okay stuff. And if it just doesn't work, or it's the way we do it because it's always been done that way, but it doesn't work, being courageous enough to offload that stuff that after measuring it is having no real value for staff or students. And I think this avoids the danger of hoarding programs just because it has always been done that way. And I don't want to list the types of programs, but I'm sure if you're where you're sitting right now, where you're joining us from, you probably could make a really decent list in your school of the types of things that are occurring that are just not beneficial to people's time. So I'm going to leave you to do that rather than start listing them, but I reckon we'd probably come up with some pretty similar things. So this is your race today. It's really probably a bit of a long lead in. This is your race. I'm just going to launch a poll. I really like to get an idea of the people that are in I suppose in this webinar today. You'll have some control over the dashboard. So if you have a question, you feel free to ask, and I'll keep an eye out for it. I can see them come up on my dashboard on my computer, and I'll answer them if I can in real time, or look at an area of that might need some further discussion later down the track. So if you do have a question, or I'll see it pop up and I'll do my best to answer that for you. So the starting point. So I just wanted to establish what role you're currently in. I'm just going to launch this poll. I'm going to let you, if you'd like, if you could answer that. Select one of the following. So you're either a teacher, support staff, principal, assistant leader. I'll give you a couple of moments to answer that for me, and then we'll continue on. Okay, just a couple more people just waiting for an answer. Okay, we might close that poll. I'll just share the results. So yeah, we've got a whole bunch of teachers in the room today. Obviously some support staff, some leaders and some system leaders. So I will try and cover off on all of that stuff, but I think when we look at this stuff, it's really applicable, particularly right in the classroom, that it'll have value across all the areas of the school as well. Okay, so the other one I also was a little interested in, we'll run this as well. So I'll just the biggest challenge for you. So I'm just going to when we look at, so this one here is, what is your big challenge in measuring student progress? So how often you should be measuring their progress, discriminating between data-driven and data-informed approaches. I'm not sure where that H went. Something's missing here, but that's all right. Having confidence when interrogating the data, ensuring that the data provides clear evidence of student progress, and knowing how to communicate your impact or value-added impact. So, if you could fire away an answer there, that would be great, and I'll certainly make sure that I address the area that looks as though it's the most need, but I think I'll cover off on it anyway. And if you're stuck and you go, oh, there's a few answers here, I will cover off on them, but I'm just interested from the people here. So I'll give you another couple of minutes, or sorry, another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we will. I'll share these results with you. All right, I reckon I'm going to close this poll and share the results. So we've got ensuring the data provides clear evidence of progress. Great. And knowing how to communicate your impact or value added impact. And also, something certainly when we look at it as school as a community, knowing how to communicate that beyond the classroom walls and beyond our meetings inside the school, I'm certainly going to cover off on that. So I'm just going to hide those results and head to the next slide. So value added. That's the one that I suppose I've been harping on a little bit around how we're value adding to our students. So the focus of measuring what matters is purely about the data that we capture, and I suppose how we use it to value add to our students, our teaching, and across our school community. So before we get started with this next run of slides, I just want you to ponder for a moment about how your school or place of work, mainly schools by the looks of it, and how you know if you are value adding to it. If you need to jot that down, it's certainly not something that I'm going to be privy to, but I just want you to consider how you know that you're value adding to the work that you're doing. And so I'm not going to ponder on this too long. So if you need to write that down and maybe something to consider after this webinar, but I just, for me, it certainly was a question, and a question that I've been talking to principals and teachers about today, is how they know that they're value adding to their students. The other one was, who checks in on your performance and then holds you accountable when you make changes and set new goals? So I'm just interested in that. So again, who checks in on your performance and holds you accountable when changes need to be made to the work that you're doing? So I'll leave you to think about that, and that again would be worth, it's certainly a really powerful question to ask in staff meetings or in team meetings or hub meetings, whatever structure you might be using at your school. Certainly one to think about. And I think the other one, I like a good celebration, and I think the other one is, who celebrates with you when you get it right or nail it? Because I think that's critically important, that we celebrate the heck out of those. It could be a small gain that you've had, or those really big gains that you just want to tell the whole school community about. It's always interesting to know who you celebrate that with. So as we aim to use evidence to empower our teaching, we have to consider, are we measuring what matters? Now, value add measures empower teachers to improve instruction and learning programs, because it cuts the guesswork out and focuses on what is working or not working. And I never had an issue if things were not working, as long as they were addressed and tinkered with, modified, thrown out, started again, as long as that was evolving. If it's not working, there's no point in banging our head against a brick wall. It's a busy job teaching. We need to move on and find something or modify something so it does work, and we can actually check our impact as we go. I think it's essentially measures the impact a teacher is having on a group of students, and you should, I think as a teacher, you should be really open to that communication and that feedback. And that feedback can come verbally, it can come through assessment, it can come through those layers of assessment, summative, formative, or even when it gets to those the diagnostic assessments that we may use to look at those a PM or a torch or a Fonnes and Pinnell, whatever it might be, those measures as well. Just that essentially that we're open to that impact, and if it's not working, we've got good support around us to share practice, find other resources, look at other options, but we keep a really open mind to that. That can sound a little confronting, but if it happens in every classroom across the school with the sharing of practice, I reckon you have the opportunity to build a really incredible learning culture where it's okay to make mistakes as long as there is a plan to correct them. Interestingly, our kids watch us operate in a classroom, and particularly through this Catherine Learning, the Northern Territory Learning Commission, and what I've seen at Casuarina Street, these kids are really confident in talking to their teachers about what they think is working for them. It's structured and it's sensible about the way that they do it, but there's a real two-way conversation going on between teachers and students, that teachers feel really confident to make mistakes, and the students have got this real risk-taking mentality in regard to having a go at stuff, taking risks in their work, in what they're creating in classes. So that's a really important thing, that when we're measuring what matters, that we've got this really open dialogue between ourselves and our teaching teams to shift where the kids are going and shift our teaching practice if we need to. And I think it's more importantly having a really consistent approach. So whether that be term meetings or monthly meetings where we check in and check out with each other to check that we're on target to maybe hit the goals that we'd set, or that we can see that we're adding value to these kids via a range of measures. So when we look at this, I think it's really important to look at what is our baseline. And this is almost, particularly at this stage of the year, and if you're listening in and you're thinking, well, how's this looking at my school? So that I reckon the reality is we need to have a ground zero, a baseline position to understand what we are working with and plan accordingly. And I think if we're not armed with this information, it's really hard to move forward efficiently. Now, what are our measures and why are we using them, and how often are we using them is something you want to establish really early on in the year, and making sure that when you choose those measures that the teachers are highly skilled at delivering the test or assessment and then analysing that data. And part of that is when we talk about delivering a test, that students are prepared for the test. They know what is happening. It's not a trick, what the test is about, and the teacher has had the opportunity to walk them through example questions. I think if we don't do that, I feel like we're trying to find out what they don't know, and that's not what assessment's about. Assessment is about trying to find out what they do know and what they can do, and then we can work. We've got a starting point. Included in that is, what do we know when we're looking at baseline data, is how do we check once we've got that data and then we've figured out when we're going to check in again, that we have a model in the school, whether it be a co-inquiry model where it's a group of teachers talking about their students based on outcomes, not purely based, not wasting time, but they're structured meetings where we're sharing what's going on and we get to share practice, offer solutions, offer ideas. I think it's a really powerful place or powerful position to be in as well. The one that I think is critical, and particularly this stage of the year, is knowing our kids. Who am I? What do we know about these students? Who are they? What are their interests? How do they best learn? Those pieces of data are so critical, because if we know, for example, a young student is into cricket or netball or dancing or drama or whatever it might be, we can use that knowledge as well as the data that we've collected on them academically as a bit of leverage to get them learning. So if they're struggling with something in maths or English, we can reference something that they're interested in to give them a real life hook or a real life example to help them understand something that might feel very, a long way removed from what they've seen before. So I think that Who Am I is a critical piece of work to do. If you know 5 critical things about your students that's not based on their academic performance, you're in a really powerful position to do some great work with these kids. So look, this is not a lesson in geography at all, but I think it's really important when we talk about these measuring what matters or value-added moments, is that we are able to map students' progress, and we can do that in a number of ways. Measures that have a scale score, we can look at mapping our kids against that scale score based on national norms, state norms, or means, and get a sense of where our kids sit, and have that discussion with the students and say, this is where you're at, and these are the next things that you need to do, because essentially the scale scores and the descriptors that sit beside them are essentially telling you what the student should be able to do based on the score or the scale score that they've got. So they are really powerful moments as well to access when you're working and mapping those kids, but also the goals that you set within the school. What are some targets that we're setting for our kids? Where do we want them to be at the start of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, and being really clear about them and communicating them. And I suppose being really, I suppose, really determined and focused on achieving those goals. And if you don't, we check in and we check out and we move on and make some changes to make sure that the next time we hit that target, or do we need to modify that target if that's required. So the checking in and checking out is, how do we provide feedback to our colleagues, to our students? Could your students, and this is probably a question to consider, could your students articulate where they are at, where they are going, and what they need to do to get there? And in schools that you walk into and you ask the kids, what level are you at? Where are you going? Where are you heading? And what do you need to do to get there? They are just the best conversations. And I'm sure if your kids are doing that at your school, really powerful information for those kids to have. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why data walls in classrooms can be so incredibly, well, they really illuminate that picture for kids about the progress that they have to make and where other kids are sitting. I certainly don't see them as being a threatening thing in classrooms, and having worked in some really challenging environments, I've not yet seen a data wall go pear-shaped. The only people that seem to have an impact on data walls are pushy parents who see the data wall and want to know why their kid isn't at the top of the tree like the rest of them. So certainly from a kid's point of view, data walls don't seem to be that confronting to them at all, but it allows them to understand, here I am, this is what I've got to do, and yeah, great piece of work. Now, when it comes to parents, because I think it's really important for parents to be a part of this checking in and checking out process, because they come in for parent-teacher interviews. They may be coming in to meet with you regularly just to check in on how their child is going. Is what platforms do we use to inform parents of progress? And are we on the front foot? So you know, I'm speaking to a school today who are going to implement student-led conferences. And the discussion was, have we left it too late this year? And I said, well, you haven't left it too late, but the conversation is going to be different now because there's been some time to teach. And essentially that discussion is going to be around the progress that they're making at the moment. Whereas early on in the year, you have a really good ability to talk to the parents about what you already know about the student and what they can share with you and how they might be able to support you across the year. So things like student-led conferences can be great platforms, if they're done right, for parents to be informed of student progress as well. And I think there's no doubt that if you've got parents on side, they are a measure that absolutely matters, because they can help what you're trying to achieve in the classroom. They can do it beyond the classroom in support of reading, maths, or whatever it might look like in regard to the after-hours stuff that the kids have to do. Now, this was something that I took a photo of today. A student wrote this that's involved in this learning commission, and I just loved it. This was from a grade 6 student. And what is good evidence? Good evidence, and evidence in general, is collected data from a student's learning, and there's not always growth, and that is a reason teachers need to reflect on their evidence. And I loved it. It made my morning when I read it, and it was amazing that these young kids are starting to think so eloquently and so detailed about it's okay that they don't always make growth. And it's about what they do when they don't. And if we're trying to teach our kids to be resilient and be able to manage things when they don't go so well, what a great lesson that it's okay not to be successful all the time. It's what you do next that counts as well. So look, this is not groundbreaking in any way, but certainly the idea of a feedback loop is that essentially, if you think about the start of the year, I'm sure many of you have assessed the kids already. You may have done that at the very end of last year, got some assessment data on the students, and that's informed your planning. You've done your planning. That planning may be fluid as you go, as you work through week by week. just looking in, checking, writing your weekly planner, and then we teach. And down the track, whenever that might be, when it's planned within the school, we'll assess again. And I suppose the caution with this is that if you're going to assess, you don't want to leave it a year. You want to check in again. You know, give it. You want to try and keep those assessment moments relatively close. Well, I'm not suggesting that you would be assessing every month, but having a goal around what you might assess. So if it was something like a reading measure, it might be that you just want to check in between the testing periods. We'll use PM as an example, that you might just do a running record on them 4 or 5 weeks into the year, just to check whether that fluency might have improved a little bit. It can be done, something that can be done really quickly, just check a little reading rate thing, but it allows you just to check in, check out as you go. So it's a really simple model. We want to make sure that we assess with a careful approach, considering what are our measures and why are we using them and how often. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I really want to harp on that idea. And making sure teachers are skilled up at delivering the test or assessment, and I did speak about that. Remembering students need to be prepared for the test. And based on these results, we plan collaboratively and we share our knowledge, set goals, including timeframes before we next check our impact. So we want to be able to get busy teaching, and we just will then get busy. We check in, get busy teaching, and then check again as we go. We want to, I suppose that when we look at these ideas around what it looks like in a collaborative group, that we have a collaborative activity. That activity might be that we're looking at student assessment or student data, and we develop, I love these cooperative learning approaches because we develop really strong relationships with the people that we work with. It's a team's focus, and because it's a repeated, because it's a process and we repeat it regularly at timely intervals, we develop this culture that when we meet, we are going to talk about our kids and our teaching, and we're not going to waste time doing other stuff. The important stuff is going to be covered off in our meetings, and I suppose it allows us to have these moments. If it's 2 weeks between meetings or 4 weeks between meetings, we can set some goals around these little accelerated improvement cycles that are just, oh, I've got this student, he's really struggling with fluency, and you might just run a little intervention around something like a stopwatch reading. So they read the same passage on a stopwatch, and it's just about getting reading mileage and giving that ability to build a little bit of fluency as they read. That's just one example. So what we essentially have at the end of this is these evidence-informed teams of teachers that are questioning their practice. They've got to focus. They're interrogating the data. They're reflecting on what is working, what's not, and what could be done differently. This process, if it's done right, can be really inspiring, particularly when you or your colleagues are doing some great stuff in the room. It can challenge you if it's different to the way that you've normally thought. It can be a bit provocative, and when we have these meetings, our structures allow us to have, I suppose, robust type discussions that build on ideas and connect through collaboration. So there's a great book, I did share this last time, by a lady called Lynn Sharrett, called Putting Faces on the Data. I would highly recommend having a look at that. There's some great case studies in there. It's certainly something that I've referenced a little bit and pointed schools towards in the work that I've been doing over the last few years. I used this last time around a data conversation flowchart, and when we talk about students, this can look at, when we look at a target group, we can look at a whole group of students or a particular group of students, and we're looking at the data and figuring out whether there's a need to intervene. We want to make sure that when we are looking at the data, that we open up the real story about these kids, because we will know a lot about these kids that are outside what they do inside the classroom. So what have we observed that maybe is an antecedent or something that's been brought into the school that may be impacting on their learning? And how does the data support these observations? So have they been doing really well and dropped off dramatically, or is there a huge improvement? What are the things that are occurring there? So you've got the ability to connect with parents and either celebrate the success or ask some questions about what might not be happening. You've also got the ability to do that with students, and certainly your colleagues have the ability to share with you whatever they might know as well. And then we work out what are our next steps. We look at our planning, we make some adjustments if we need to, and are there other ways for these students to show their learning? And that's that negotiated way, particularly the Learning Commission, that these kids are negotiating with their teachers around the way that they can best show their learning. Really, really powerful way of looking at it. And then obviously there's that commitment to action, that we tell someone else that we are going to do it. And generally, if you think about anything you might have set a goal for yourself, if you tell someone that you're going to do it, often they can be a little painful in reminding you about that. I'm doing it to my wife around her fitness goals over February and March. I'm constantly saying to her in a very supportive way, how's it going? Is everything all right? Do you need any help? And that's sometimes welcomed and more than often not welcomed. But I'm doing my best. But the one that I think is really important is the commitment to action. And that's that idea that if you tell someone, it makes you accountable to do it. And essentially, the model that I'm sharing here is this idea that the evidence or data that we collect should not make you feel anchored or compliant. You want it, and it shouldn't be driving everything that you do. It's got to be informing what you're doing and empowering your teaching. Because when I talked about that layer upon layer earlier on, that's the moment where we feel anchored and compliant and that it's driving everything that we're doing. We want to make sure that it informs what we do. We are teachers as experts, and we can use the data and what we know about our kids to make some really powerful decisions around their learning. And I think if you look at it, there's a real risk versus reward idea. And I love this idea that if we make our teaching challenging and worthwhile, and I think teaching is really challenging and a really worthwhile piece of work, that if you look in the research, which speaks so much around well-being and the impact of well-being. There was another report only recently about the well-being of principals, and dare I say teachers would be in exactly the same boat, that the research suggests that if we are doing work that's challenging and worthwhile, that it has a really positive impact on our well-being as well. So teachers that have an understanding of how to employ a variety of teaching methods, have high expectations, take calculated risks and know the students well, are far more successful and strangely enough, feel better about themselves on most occasions. Now, the work that we've been doing, and Adam and I have done a fair bit of planning in the partnership that we're sort of working with a number of schools in this space at the moment, particularly the evidence-empowered partnerships, is that basically we've just put together everything that we've learnt over 20 plus years of education. He's probably he'd be more years than me. And we're basically supporting partner schools to establish processes that are sustainable and build a culture of continuous improvement. And I think the advantage of this work is that when we come in and work with schools, we aren't the principal and we're not the deputy or the teaching and learning coach. We're probably coming at your groups of teachers with the same message, but essentially we're supporting that message. And I suppose in many ways it builds a coalition of the willing, because you're hearing the message through a number of means, and it builds that importance of making sure that if we are going to gather evidence or data on our kids, that it's going to have an ability to measure the impact or the value add that we are delivering to these kids. And if we're not, we work on it. So the next steps, I reckon it's critical, those questions that I spoke about at the very beginning, is to make sure that we establish what data sets count the most at your school. Use them to measure what matters, what impact are you having, and what value do I add to my colleagues and students. And it was that question that I mentioned before, and the idea to ponder are you able to assess right now the impact that you're having on groups of students but via the data or the evidence that you're collecting? And I think it's something to consider. But I would definitely, if you're thinking about this and you're going, what data sets count the most at our school, and putting a really having a really good look at them, and when you're using them, how it's impacting on students, how well are your teachers or are teachers trained in using those assessments, and what sort of structures sit around them to support those really rigorous, inspiring, provocative type conversations that need to occur to shift the students at your school. So look, in wrapping up, I just wanted again just to point you towards the Real Schools partnerships. Obviously there are a range of partnerships that we offer. The new one that we've been really excited about, and there's been a lot of interest, there's some schools that we're working with currently in this space, is around the Evidence Empowered partnership. We work in restorative practices stuff, school leadership, school culture, but at the end of the day, so essentially that traditional one day PD event, I'm not sure they're that amazing, particularly if they're bolted on workshops that when teachers leave and go back into the busyness of their normal day, that a lot of what they learn through those PD disappears. And so from our point of view, it's about working with leaders, then working with teachers, and then setting up some targets that we can then reassess further on down the track, making some commitments around that, and then continually following up with some coaching and some data evidence and literacy training as well. I've also wrote a white paper about that, and if you would like a copy of that white paper, you certainly can let us know via the little comments section on the dashboard here, or you can go straight to the website and you'll see a link to that white paper, and you can download that white paper. You'll probably get a follow-up email from me as well, just to check in whether you want to discuss that further as well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when we look at any of the stuff that we've put together with Real Schools, it's about developing a caring bunch of students that they know from the work that you're doing with them, the data that you're sharing with them, that you care. And it's that type of stuff that becomes very infectious in the room as well. The ability that the committed group of teachers, that they learn really powerful stuff from the work that they're doing in the classroom, and how much they care for their kids, because caring teachers won't just take the data on face value. They'll pull it apart, interrogate it, they'll understand their kids, and it's that hard work that they do there that generally makes their job easier, because they're cutting out on that lag time as they try and figure out why is it not working, when they've got an ability or a structure in place that supports them through with their colleagues as well. The other one is around connecting our communities. We want to make sure that we are able to share the data that we are grabbing with the data that we're collecting, and be able to get our parents involved and supporting the work that we're doing in the classroom as well. So next steps, you can request a copy of the white paper. I've got no idea why it starts at 3. We'll just count this. It's like a countdown. You can request a copy of the white paper. You can at least download the slide deck that I've used today, and that can certainly support what you're doing. If you had any questions around that slide deck, if you were going to share that with your team, yeah, feel free to contact us, and we certainly will support you there as well. Or you can, in the question box, just write chat, and we will endeavour to get in contact with you in the next 24 to 48 hours to answer any questions that you may have, or yeah, go from there as well. And then so the next webinar in line is the student leadership webinar, and that's around elevating student voice through a meaningful approach to capacity. That's the Real Schools webinar that's occurring on the 15th of March. I'll just remind you in regard to the Real Schools partnership that it's more than us rocking up. There's a whole, there's a massive amount, years of resources now. I'm writing constantly weekly newsletters along with Adam, but there's membership, there's weekly newsletters. We're writing monthly membership resources for both teachers and leaders, and they're all referenced back to AITSL standards. A monthly webinar like today, and access to a back catalogue of resources. So if you're interested in partnering, or you want to share this with your leadership team and they may want to have a conversation with us, we're more than happy to have that conversation. All our work, from my perspective, is about trying to inspire, engage leadership and teacher professional learning, and also get our parents involved in that space as well. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Again, if you want to have a chat, you can just let us know via the control panel, and the resources around the white paper or the slide deck from today are available to you. You just let us know that you need that. So thank you very much. Great speaking to you today. Have a beautiful evening. See ya.